The airline industry is taking another major hit during the pandemic. United Airlines is furloughing over 16,000 jobs starting in October. NBC News business and technology correspondent Ling joins me now. Joe, first, just tell us more about these cuts. What do we know?
Hey, Savannah, over 16,000 jobs will be cut starting October 1st because that is when the CARES Act expires and that aid that was provided for the airlines runs out. And there's no extension from Congress just yet. The silver lining here, though, is 16,000 jobs is actually less than half than the 36,000 that United was originally preparing for. And why is that? It's because a lot of people took voluntary buyouts. They did early retirement. They're doing fewer hours, say, working fewer hours and hanging on to their health insurance. So all of those options made it possible for United to cut fewer workers. But, United's still hurting really badly along with all of the other airlines, and saying in this statement, sadly, we don't expect demand to return to anything resembling normal until there's a widely available treatment or vaccine. Now, Savannah, this also comes after American Airlines announced 19,000 job cuts. So you can just feel for all of us who are not flying, whether it's for work or for pleasure, it's really wreaking havoc on the travel industry, and it's continued to do so for the foreseeable future.
Absolutely. I know for all of us who are used to being on planes all the time for work, it certainly feels different, but everybody having to cancel vacations, all that kind of stuff. Let's talk through furloughs versus layoffs. Many of these are furloughs, not layoffs, but people, of course, will still be out of work. It means they don't have a job or a paycheck. Does United have plans to rehire these employees when they can?
That's the hope, right? Is that if demand goes back to normal or even increases a bit, United is able to call back some of these workers. But again, if you look at where we are right now, where it comes to demand and the uncertainty around a vaccine, a lot of these airlines say, look, we don't expect things to improve anytime soon. That's why we're making these big job cuts.
Now, another major company trimming its labor force is Ford. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ford is cutting about 1,400 salaried white-collar jobs. So this isn't inside the Ford plants and factories around the country. And the reason they say they're cutting is not because of the coronavirus pandemic. It's because of an ongoing restructuring. Now, this follows about 7,000 jobs being eliminated last year, pre-pandemic. And Ford is really shifting the way it's doing business. It's focusing more on these battery-powered and more efficient vehicles. It's trying to trim down the size of the company. And it's also just ahead of their current CEO leaving, and he will be replaced soon by Jim Farley. And so this is a part of that big redesign of the company. So they say it's not because of the pandemic, but you still see these job cuts, and it still contributes to the overall economic pain that so many are feeling right now, Savannah.
So much economic pain and just so many questions about when we'll go back to normal, when we will actually all be on flights again. All right, Joe, thanks so much for your reporting.
Yeah, seriously. No problem.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.